Hello there. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about IB English A and how to do paper 2, which is perhaps one of the trickier parts of the course. I'm going to be talking about two particular texts, Things Fall Apart and Chronicle of a Death Foretold, which are two of the most popular IB texts to this particular paper. If you're not using these, the skills and the ideas, the techniques behind the essay writing still apply, so you can still carry on watching and hopefully learn something. So I'm going to take this particular question and show you various steps that you can apply to any question and hopefully come up with a good answer. So here's the question. Many works are concerned with human suffering. How's that expressed in a way that engages audiences of various times and places? So the first step I like to do is trying to think about what kind of question is it? There's only so many types of question IB can ask you. There's probably about 6 or 7 categories. Could be about author or reader or theme or anything like that. This particular one is clearly about the theme of human suffering. But the second part of the question, talking about engaging audiences or readers of various times, is a different strand about in terms of the reader and reader response. So that's actually useful. That gives you two different things, the theme of suffering and how readers react to it. So that's the first thing in my head. I need to get that clear. What kind of question am I looking at? Second stage is turning it into easy English. The IB questions can be quite complex and off-putting, so try and simplify it. So here I've got many works are about suffering. How does that engage audiences of various times, places? Much simpler, much more bite-sized and manageable. The important thing here is A, not to change the meaning of any of the question, and also B, not to ignore any part of the question. If you do that, you've got something worth working with. Third part is brainstorming, and this part you need to take a fair bit of time. You want to brainstorm and think, right, what are the big ideas here? In general terms, how can I answer this question and the parts of the question? And you get a 5-minute reading time at the beginning where you're already picking your question. After that, you want to spend another few minutes just on this stage thinking giving yourself a little bit of time to come up with big ideas. So I've come up with these initial ideas, A, B, C, and D. Initially, we could look at how suffering is expressed through the protagonists. How do they suffer? Possibly even an antagonist in one case. Secondly, broadening it out a little bit, widening it. How do societies suffer? And as a subsection of that, maybe how women suffer in both texts. Broadening it out a bit further and going back to the second part of the question, how is suffering engaging the actual readers themselves? How does it engage them? And that obviously depends on their context and where they come from, and also when they read the text. And the last part, the why paragraph. I like having a why paragraph because that's really why I'm going to talk about here about why the writers are doing this. And it's very important with paper 2 to talk about the writers, not only the characters and what happens. So having this paragraph at the end forces me to return to the authors. Okay, let's move on to the next stage, organizing your ideas. Once you've got your key ideas, think about the best order you want them in, not just the order you thought of. In general, the best ideas should be towards the end, so you finish strong, and having that why paragraph towards the end also helps with this. At this stage, you can start to hang the various quotes and examples that you have onto each of those key points that you wish to make. If you have particularly long examples, you might want to write them out at the start of the essay of the exam, just so they're out of your mind and you're not worrying about forgetting them. Once you've got that, you've got your basic structure and plan, and you're kind of ready to write. So I'm going to go through those 4 points I showed you a moment ago in a little bit more detail. So the first one, how the protagonists suffer. Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart clearly suffers. He has a fatal flaw that means he can't change. He refuses to change, much like the Igbo society. That makes him, in literary terms, a tragic character, and he's therefore kind of doomed. Bad things are going to happen to him. So we see how he suffers, and we feel sorry for him. Feeling sorry for an African antagonist in the 1950s was quite an unusual thing. In Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Santiago clearly is the victim because he's killed very unjustly. He's depicted in a Christ-like way in various examples throughout the text, and he's basically a scapegoat. He has to suffer in order for the Vicario family to restore their honor. On the other hand, the antagonist, the Vicario brothers, we do have some sympathy for them because they seem forced into this kind of ritualistic killing purely to save face, rather than because they genuinely feel they should kill. So that's the characters. In terms of the wider society, broadening out now, the Igbo suffer a loss of identity. The Igbo clearly suffers, and we have sympathy for them. We'll come back to why we need to have sympathy for them later. In Chronicle, Colombian society has a lot of hubris, or too much pride. It values on them far too much, and it tries to blame everyone or everything but themselves for the killing. And as a result, they end up suffering themselves by the narrator coming back years later, desperately trying to change the story. And the last section there about women, in some sense, both women also suffer in both societies. So you could look at things through a feminist lens. Okay, moving on. How the reader suffers. So now this is the second part of the question. I need to address that. If we look at the context, so not just the book that you read, but when it was published and really who the readers were intended to be. 1950s and 1960s, probably still some preconceived ideas about Africa needing to be civilized and saved, and the justification for colonization that was used still existed in some parts. So in a sense, Achebe is asking us to rethink our attitudes at that time, and therefore the readers at the time suffer partly because of their ignorance. In Chronicle, it's written originally in Spanish, so it's aimed at a community that perhaps had similar values to some extent. So because of that, the readers also possibly suffer, and it is after all based on a real life story. So we see that through the suffering, there is a form of sort of a cathartic effect. Cathartic means a kind of healing effect, and both writers write in order to draw criticism of, or to point out criticism of aspects of their societies, but also possibly to suggest improvements and a better path. The last section will talk about the writer's intentions, and this is really important. In Things Fall Apart, we want to show that Achebe is trying to portray a very detailed, complex African society to prove that it wasn't in need of saving or suffering necessarily, and therefore it suffers needlessly. Chronicle of Death Foretold is the community is very hypocritical. It seems to be very religious, waiting for the bishop to pass by. Really, that's just a facade, and they willingly allow this, like effectively condone this murder right in front of themselves, and therefore we see how that community suffers, and Garcia Marquez criticizes them for trying to assuage themselves of their guilt. Okay, moving on to the actual writing stage. When you're writing, some practical tips: have the question and the planning in front of you. You could do it on a separate answer sheet and have it somewhere on your table, so it's there the whole time. All the time, directly answer the question, go back to it. Start with a thesis statement, and then all of your paragraphs should actually link back to prove how you're showing this thesis statement is true. Signposting is also important, those color-coded ABCDs. You can briefly mention them in your introduction just to give you some organization. You get marks for organization. So let's have a quick look at how that may look. This is the thesis statement. You can read that yourself, and it's followed by the signposting. You can see I've color-coded a very small paragraph just to show, right, okay, now this is where I'm going to take you. These are the next steps. In the writing section, if you follow P or PQA or something like that, it's the same principle all the way through. Make sure your opening sentence is basically that key point, and then return to that at the end of the paragraph after you've added lots of examples, and just show how you've proved that point is true. Lastly, give yourself, if you can, around about 10 minutes at the end to actually check through your answer. Check it firstly for grammar and spelling. Make sure it works okay, or check for grammar and spelling, but also check for does it make sense type of question. Does it flow? Is each paragraph introduced properly? And if you check for does it make sense, and then is the grammar and spelling okay, you should have yourself a reasonably good answer. Okay, so try and follow those various steps. They'll take you through the process you need for paper 2, and I hope you do very well. Thank you.